What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. In today's video, we're doing a little bit of an oddball video, but a video that I feel like you will all, if you're a Madden fan on my channel, find a bit informative or maybe even useful in some way for your own purposes. And in today's video, what we're going to talk about is player ratings, how I adjust player ratings, some of my complaints with the way that the EA ratings adjusters set ratings within the game and things like that. We're going to encompass it all into one video today as I go through a little bit of the roster and show you guys how I edit player ratings and set things up to be more realistic within my franchises. And ultimately, I feel that some of this information could be extremely useful to you guys in gauging how you guys might be able to address ratings and things like that in your own franchises. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and go to the roster here on Madden 22. We are on Next Gen, and I go to Edit Roster right here, and I just go to Manage Players, and this is how you edit a roster. I've made videos on this in the past, but you can simply edit players from here. Let's say I specifically edited TJ Watt, and then I could go save this by clicking in the right stick, and I could save this roster. However, what I want to first talk about is one of my biggest issues within the game, and I feel like it is more of a comparative look at positions within the league, because I really feel like they don't do a fantastic job of comparing players on a position by position basis. And I feel like that is one of the first things that I do whenever I adjust my roster. I first sort by a position, and I take a look at who the top players are and how these players rank with each other within the league. And as you do this position by position comparison, you will likely very quickly notice some oddities that you're probably going to say, hey, this needs to be adjusted. So for example, right here, I was scrolling through, and one of the first ones that I found, I went to the right end position, and it has Myles Garrett as a 99 overall along with Aaron Donald as a 99 overall. Now this is going to lead into some of my other points within the game about the ratings, and we'll talk about those in more depth. But can you honestly look at both Myles Garrett and Aaron Donald and say that one player isn't better than the other? I think that that is a huge disservice to Aaron Donald, a player that has been a candidate for defensive MVP pretty much every year that he's been in the league, and Aaron Donald would be the only true player that I would consider to be a potential 99 overall at that position, and anybody else other than that has to be at least one overall, if not multiple overalls lower than them. Now that's not to discredit Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett has been a great player within the league, and he is one of the most unstoppable pass rushers within the game right now, so he certainly deserves to be in elite territory, but I would say that Aaron Donald is certainly better than him, and that deserves to be recognized within the ratings. That just brings me to one other point here. TJ Watt wins Defensive Player of the Year and is only rated as a 96 overall, so that again is not reflected in the ratings. So that brings me to one other point, and that is that there is bias within these ratings that is very clear within the game. I don't know why it is slanted a certain way or another. I know that they have certain former players working with ratings adjustments and things of that nature, like Chad Ochocinco and whatnot, and I can't imagine that they are the best at understanding every single position and rating every single position. I think that I've made my thoughts clear on those guys in the past, but nonetheless, how do you have a Defensive Player of the Year who does not get a 99 overall rating, but the other players that were beat out for that rating were given a 99 rating? And you could say, okay, well, maybe it is player history. Well, that's one of the biggest problems with the ratings within Madden, is that they do not consider players' history and their performance over time as heavily as they should within consideration for a player's rating. So there's really no logical reasoning that I can think of that they decide to give one player a 99, but another player that beat them out for an award not a 99. I mean, for example, in previous years, Stephon Gilmore was gifted a 99 overall the very moment that he won Defensive Player of the Year, and I believe strongly that that was because he was a Patriot. So there are certain teams that are favored more than others. I believe that maybe they take into account the team's overall and things of that nature, which might be taken into account too heavily. And, you know, those things could be playing a factor, but nonetheless, I go through position by position and find comparisons to determine who's better. And again, you'll find a lot of players at a very similar overall. So Tre'Davious White and Stephon Gilmore, for example, both a 94. I don't know yet who I would rank above the other, but I very easily could go take a look at their statistics and see that one player is more than likely better than the other, especially when you factor in their career history, and therefore there are going to be too many players that are at the exact same overall. And again, I just mentioned the fact that there is way too much weight on current performance in comparison to historic performance from this player and career performance from this player. I personally tend to weigh a player's career performance heavier than a player's current performance, because it's more likely to have a player have a down year or have an off year or have a flash in the pan type of a year than it is to have a player that plays elite across their entire career. And so, for example, I wanted to take a look at Russell Wilson in today's video. Russell Wilson is a player that is undisputed one of the elite quarterbacks within the NFL. Most people over his career would put him as a top 5 quarterback in the NFL because he had one inconsistent year this year while still playing with a terrible offensive line and nothing around him. He was given this 88 overall rating, yet he still kept his X factor for some reason. So he goes down below 90, which is kind of like the base threshold for an X factor player, and he is keeping that X factor, but still being rated at an 88. They're saying he's not as good as Josh Allen, not as good as Lamar Jackson, not as good as Dak Prescott, which I think are all completely false. If you take a look at his career stats, which I'm going to put up on the screen for you here while we're talking about this subject. And then ultimately, you also get players that have had a few very good seasons within the league, like a Patrick Mahomes, a Lamar Jackson, for example, that are rated significantly higher than they probably should be rated, because Patrick Mahomes, yes, he is one of the best quarterbacks of this era, and he's going to likely be one of, if not the best quarterback of all time. However, he is not that yet. He is only 24 years old. He has only played 4 years within the league, and 3 very good years at that. But you could take a look at a player like a Russell Wilson, who has played 9 elite seasons within the league, maybe a couple of down years here and there, and is no doubt the most important player on that team, and doesn't get a whole lot of help from other players around him when you have a player like a Patrick Mahomes, who does certainly get a lot of help from players around him. But what I am simply saying is that we should not just simply be factoring in recent performance. We should absolutely be factoring in a player's career history and their ability to perform over and over again at a certain level throughout their career. The next thing that I want to talk about is player brackets. I want to talk about the fact that most of the starting players within the game are going to be an 80 or above. You'll occasionally see the 70-ish overall player. Maybe you decide to start a rookie player or something like that, and that is super unrealistic. In reality, ratings are on a scale from 1 to 100, and in fact, they're on a scale of like 26 to 100. I think 26 or around there, or 16 might be the lowest overall a player can actually be within the game, but nonetheless, the curve for a rating system within the game is skewed way too high. There are way too many players on the very high end. When you think about a grading system within school, a general grading system that is accepted in a lot of areas is the 70-ish range is a C, which is kind of an acceptable range. B is good, and that would be 80 plus, and then A is great, 90 plus. But then you are also going to have the players that are a D, which are 60 plus, and the players that are an F, which would be anything below a 60, anything in the 50s and below. So I would like to see a rating system that skews it more towards a realistic grading system. There should be many more starting players that are within that C range, that 70s range, and there should even potentially be some starting players that are in that 60s range that just aren't great starters. They haven't lived up to expectation or whatever it might be, but they're plug-and-play players that are just filling a void for that specific team at that point in time. Whenever we take a look at running backs within the roster, for example, there are 33 running backs that are above an 80 overall. That's more than the number of starting running backs in the league. So I find it hard to believe that every single starting running back in the league is a good or great player. There are quite a few starting running backs in the league that are subpar players, especially in today's passing NFL. These players are not the same as they used to be. You don't have Barry Sanders types of players. You don't have these elite type of running backs within the game, and therefore the stat brackets for these players need to be adjusted. Generally, the stat brackets that I would refer to is in order to be a 95 or above, you have to be in the conversation to be one of the best players at that position of all time. So we would potentially be talking about a Derrick Henry, a Tom Brady, maybe a Patrick Mahomes, an Aaron Rodgers, maybe eventually Devontae Adams, Cooper Kupp, DeAndre Hopkins, those types of players. We're talking about players that have been an impact on the game that has actually changed the way that the game is played. Now, the next up category or bracket would be players in the 90 to 95 range. These would be your traditional X Factor players. These are players that are really good for their team right now and maybe have been good for their team for 2 to 3 years or something like that, or maybe they've done it for longer and they've just not reached that level of being a Hall of Fame or a best of all time type of a player. And we would be talking about maybe some of these like receivers, for example, that have only done it for a few years, like a Tyreek Hill. Is he going to be considered one of the best players of all time at the wide receiver position? As of right now, no. He might eventually get there, but he certainly shouldn't be a 96. Based on my rating system, he would be more in the 90 to 95 range, where most X factors would fall. And then the next bracket would be in the 85 to 89 range. You're talking about players that are superstars for their team. They're always getting the ball, they're always making big plays, but they're not necessarily yet a Hall of Fame type of a player, or they haven't reached that elite level where they absolutely change the way that the game is played, or they change the way an opponent has to game plan against them. So superstars would be in that 85 to 89 range, maybe 84 and up per se, and that's not to leave out the younger players that have a high ceiling. There should certainly be younger players that have superstar dev that aren't quite that overall yet, and we'll get into that in a bit in another point, but nonetheless, the bracket for superstars should be in the mid to high 80s, and then star players on your team, players that have a pretty solid impact, they have a lot of room to grow, that are significant contributors to your team, but they're not that superstar player. They're not a face of the franchise, for example, would be in that like 78 to 84 range. We're talking about players that have a significant impact on the team, but aren't necessarily elite or anything like that. And then the next bracket would be plug and play type starters, which would be players in the high to low 70s, maybe even down into the 60s. So if we took a look at the quarterback position, for example, we would be taking a look at players like a Jameis Winston or a Teddy Bridgewater or some of the developmental quarterbacks. However, they're all rated high up into the 70s, and a few of these players I could even consider maybe being a little bit lower than they are, and spacing these ratings a little bit lower. That's one of the things that happens whenever you start to take away some of the excess number of high overall quarterbacks and bump them down a little bit, it kind of trickles down and bumps all these other guys down a couple of ratings and allows for more players to compete down here at the lower level, which is what actually happens within the NFL. And then you have the replacement level players that are going to be into the 60s that are actually serviceable. Unfortunately, there aren't a whole lot of those players within the roster. At the quarterback position, they do a half-decent job of doing this with players like Joe Flacco or Jordan Love or Gardner Minshew, but they also severely underrate some of the best backup quarterbacks within the league. Guys like Kyle Allen, who have had some amount of success, should probably be a little bit higher overall. Matt Moore, a quarterback that has been in the league for 14 years, is only a 63 overall. I would think that if he came into a game, he would be smart enough to control the game and do well enough to be considered maybe like a 68 overall, maybe a 70 overall or something of that matter. So there's a lot of wonkiness going on with the stat brackets for these players. You either have the players that are 80 and above and starting for your team, or you're just straight trash, unfortunately, with the way the game actually rates players. I would even consider skewing that entire curve lower in order to get a wider variety of overalls and get a wider variety of player performance. If you made it so that, for example, 40s and 50s were the low end of players, you would notice so much more of a difference between the way they play and the way the most elite players play within the game, and that would make a huge difference in the realism of the game. You would notice actual noticeable differences between the most elite players and every bracket below that. And that just leads me to my next point, which is it's really kind of hard to tell the separation between players within the game. If we go back to the running back position, for example, could you point to the exact overall where it flips between an elite player and a great player, or the exact point where it flips between a starter caliber player and a superstar caliber player? Because I can't point to that overall within the way the game actually rates their players. I would say anything above an 80 is very solid within the game, a very good starter, but there's no separation between these groups of players. You have actual brackets of players within the NFL, players that are considered elite, players that are considered very good, players that are considered solid, players that are considered serviceable, and there is no separation between these players within the game, unfortunately, and so I look to do that whenever I adjust the ratings. One of my biggest problems, if not the biggest problem that I have with Madden's rating system, is making completely unserviceable players within the game that are actually good within real life. And I understand that these ratings are based off of 40 times, or I should say loosely based off of 40 times and combined stats and things of that nature. However, the EA devs, or the ratings adjusters, also need to understand how their own rating system works and how the actual game plays. Because if any one of those ratings adjusters actually played the game with an 87 overall running back, they would know that they're almost completely unusable. So a Josh Jacobs, for example, should not have 87 speed. The minimum speed for a running back like this should be like that 89 range, and they should certainly be given better acceleration to get them up to that top speed quicker. Or, for example, a Alexander Mattinson, who is on the Vikings, should not be given 86 speed, because that makes them virtually worthless within the game, because it's almost impossible to have success with an 86 speed running back. You have to try really hard and do a lot of things right to have success with an 86 speed running back, and I don't even think that that is accurate to the player's actual 40 time within real life. And if it is, they certainly play faster than that on an NFL field. Now, unfortunately, this is a problem that we see at multiple positions. We see it at the halfback position. We see things skewed in both directions at the wide receiver position, with too many wide receivers having 95 plus speed and too many elite wide receivers having low enough speed that makes them almost ineffective as well, like a Michael Thomas, for example, who only has 87 speed. Like I said, I know they're not the fastest players in the world, but if you know anything about the way the system actually works and the way the game actually works, you kind of want to set these things at a minimum of an 89. And likewise, the same thing happens at defensive back positions. You'll get a lot of high overall corners that only have 88 speed or 87 speed or things of that nature, and that's a total disservice to the way that they actually play because it doesn't reflect real life play. And then I want to get into, I think, what'll be my final point of this video to avoid dragging this out too long, and that is the entire dev system. Unfortunately, and this is a direct request to EA, if anybody over there is watching this video, please allow us to edit player devs at the main menu. For some reason, you actually have to go into a franchise to edit player developments. Now, I can go in here and I can take a look at what a player's abilities are, but I can't edit them. I can go in and look at a player's attributes, but I can't edit their development from the main menu. Unfortunately, I can only do that stuff from a franchise mode, and that's a total disservice to the community that is out here fixing these rosters. For example, there are a lot of very young players within the league that have been drafted very high overall that should have some of the highest ceilings within the game and have super high pedigree, like Tremaine Edmonds, for example, who should be a superstar caliber player. He's one of the best linebacker prospects in the entire NFL, and every single year they fail to give him superstar development. And this is a thing that happens with the game year after year after year, and we have to fix it every time we go into franchise mode and properly assign star and superstar development traits to these young players that Madden just doesn't see a reason to give it to for some reason. So with all that being said, hopefully you guys find this information valuable or interesting in some way. Like I said, it's more of a discussion video and an informative video, but I do hope you guys enjoyed. And if you did, leave that like down below, subscribe to the channel if you're new, or subscribe to the channel if you've watched my videos and you're not new here. I know a lot of you guys watch my videos and actually aren't subscribed. The statistics are there, I can see them. Make sure you guys hit that subscribe button, comment down below with what your thoughts are, and I'll see you guys as always in the next one. I hope you have a good one.